been doing this work my whole life. You just realize that if you're if you're going to spend your life shaking the trees, occasionally a coconut's going to hit you on the head,
Quite a few. So
that's right.
I want to dive in. So Speakeasy podcast
That's good.
listeners, I just started the recording because I didn't want to miss anything.
I saw it. Yeah, no problem.
I just don't want to miss anything, because when it comes to advocacy, I think we give power to somebody's voice according to the power within our own voice. And it can be a powerful thing, or it can be a damaging thing. Because if you're someone who thinks that you haven't had a voice, or that in some instance there's been some tragedy in your life where your voice has been removed, oftentimes it gives you a different perspective and a different perception of somebody who's an advocate. You're like, well, why are they doing all of this? Why would they risk their lives? Why would they go out and march? What is marching going to do? But Speakeasy podcast listeners, if you've learned nothing else, learn that every person, there's a value within every person. And when we fight for the rights of others, we're fighting for a better society as a whole. So I'm super excited about the guest that I have on today, because we're going to dive into some deep things that you may not have been discussing, or things that you've only discussed behind closed doors. With that being said, I want to say hello, Howard. How are you?
Wow, it was so good to see you. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh my goodness, I'm excited. As someone who has I guess I kind of stumbled into advocacy when it comes to women in domestic violence and with homelessness. It wasn't like I ran in and was like, yes, this is what I wanted to do. It was kind of like, I've been where you are. I want to be that voice for you. And with that being said, Howard, how did you get started in advocacy and advocating? Because you've been doing this for quite some time.
Yeah, for my whole life. I think I was sharing with you earlier, I think I went to my first civil rights meeting when I was 15 or 16 years old, and I'm going to be 70 in January. So that's like 55 years. So it's just, it is a long time, and it's changed over time. But I think like a lot of people, my own personal story and my family story had a lot to do with it. I'm Jewish, and my family came from Eastern Europe, and we suffered enormous loss during the Holocaust. We know that, excuse me, for example, 43 members of our family were murdered on August 2nd and 3rd, 1942, when the Nazis came into the village my grandfather grew up in the Western Ukraine, and killed all but 100 of the 5,000 Jews who lived there. And that was just one aspect of our family. So I was born in January 1951, so I grew up in the heavy shadow of that. And then I also came from a family of people who had been advocates. My grandfather was the person in Baltimore who headed up the group that purchased the Exodus ship, which of course went to liberate Jewish children from the Nazis. And my grandmother in New York was an organizer for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. So we got two very strong messages growing up, which is that bad things can happen, and you're supposed to do something about it. And so it became sort of, in a way, in my generation, our family business. Like a lot of people of my generation, my parents were depression kids who focused on getting their kids in college and things like that. But my older sister became one of our nation's leading immigration lawyers. My younger sister was Marian Wright Edelman's fundraiser at the Children's Defense Fund for many years. And I started my career as an educator, working with very young children, and a lot of whom came from a low-income African-American community in Kensington, Maryland, and then eventually became a consultant working with organizations, and the social justice side of it has always continued on a social level. So it's funny when people ask me that question, because I don't remember a time when I wasn't. It's just what I've done my whole life, so.
And that slides right into a topic that a lot of people are kind of like, I guess, spread out about when it comes to, advocating. And something I spoke on maybe about, I think it was last year, that our youth, you guys, came together and did the national walkout. And I think that really sparked some things for people, because we saw a shift at that time, and we're seeing it even more now, where advocacy has never been something that's not happened. It's always been something that's been needed and necessary in order to instill change, in order to shift the dynamic of people, people's thought patterns, of how they see, how they understand, how they hear people. And so it's always been there. But I think for the first time in a long time, we're seeing this new generation say, we're not allowing you to take anything and put it over our eyes or our ears. We want to hear it all. We want to see it all. And we're going to be vocal. And I think that's really significant because we haven't really seen this much of a push from one generation since the boomers and what they did while they were younger. And so, they talk about how everything goes in cycles. What has been your experience with some of the younger generation that have come out and said, you know what, we're going to be a voice. We're not going to be silenced.
Look, I love the Zoomer generation. I think, people's passion, and I think, and we stand on the shoulders of those in front of us, or those behind us, I should say. We stand on, like I said, I stood on my grandparents' shoulders, and also the people of their generation who had to try to do what they had to do. And I think people are standing on, to some degree, the shoulders of our generation. And I think clearly people of this generation grew up in a different environment because of some of the things we were able to do in the 60s and beyond. And hopefully people in the future will stand on their shoulders. And, I was trained by Saul Alinsky, the great organizer. And Alinsky used to talk about how we have to be, I think we have to be aware of the emotional impact all this has on us, and we can use that emotional impact to fuel us, but we also have to be strategic, and the balance between those two is really important. It's natural for us to want change immediately and to want it now, and it's also just true because of the nature of groups and people and group dynamics and history. We know that change doesn't happen that way necessarily. It doesn't happen like a turn of the switch. And in fact, when you try to have things happen in that way, it can have consequences. So you look at things like the French Revolution and what happened with Robespierre and people like that. And so I do think that we have to be careful to keep pushing, but at the same time recognize the reality that people are not going to flip from one extreme to the other instantly. And if we try to force it too much, it's a little bit like I said to somebody recently, it's a little bit like pulling a plant upwards to try to make it grow faster. It can only grow but so fast. And the danger of that is backlash. And I think we're beginning to see that now in Trump's reaction to some of the things that are happening, and Attorney General Barr's reaction to some of the things that are happening. And the ability to take incidents of extremes and try to create a narrative that undermines your whole process. And so we have to keep moving forward with what we're doing, but we also want to reach out and enroll people. I think enrollment is the key word here. As opposed to demonizing the other side, we want to try to, as much as possible, enroll people and invite them into our conversation. And that can be a challenge sometimes when we're enraged and filled with the kind of legitimate passion and anger and fear that a lot of people have now after watching things like the George Floyd lynching and things like that.
It's so, there's so many gems that you just dropped, but the emotional piece was the biggest one for me, because I think a lot of times we do allow emotion to drive us. And when we allow emotion to drive us, we're not clearly thinking. And so there have been so many people who have made decisions just, recently. Let's just look at this year based on emotion. And when we base it off of emotion, emotions are subject to change. When we look at the facts are the facts. But when we look at emotions, emotions change. And so when you're driven to act and react because of your emotion, man, it definitely does. It creates a dangerous space. And I think that's where we see the shift going from protesting to looting and rioting. And it's a big jump.
Yeah, although sometimes it's a subtle one. I mean, and we also have to recognize, I rember from, when we were doing demonstrations back in the 60s, that, one of the greatest danger we had were the people who weren't the people who were there for the cause. They were kind of using that to forward their own agendas. And it might have been just they like chaos and wreaking havoc for the hell of it. It's the same energy that had been panty raids the year before was now being out on the street, because they were just like getting drunk and doing stuff. And it was those people who were less disciplined and who were just following their, their emotional rage that often were the people who were the greatest threat to what we were trying to do. Because if we were trying to in a very disciplined way, move forward with protest. I mean, you had somebody come in who just picked up a rock and threw it at the police officers. Now the police officers had a reason to charge. They had a reason to throw tear gas. They had a reason to come in with their nightsticks. And you had to deal with that all the time. And I think there's no question we're dealing with that now. We know that what happens sometimes is that people use this as an excuse for looting or use it as an excuse for mayhem. And in this case, we know that there also are people, right wingers, these groups like the Proud Boys and these other boogaloos, I guess they're called, and others who are coming in and intentionally creating violent action, or even throwing rocks into homes and things like, or stores and things like this, to make the violence part of the action, even though those aren't even the people who are supporting it. They're trying to create an image to it. So I think it's important that, and this is one of the things that Alinsky really taught us, is that discipline is really important. And I completely understand the feelings associated. I completely understand at this point where a lot of folks, especially African-American folks, would say, just burn the thing down. I mean, it just has never worked for us. It's been 400 years of oppression, and it's just never going to work for us. And I completely understand those feelings. And at the same time, we have to recognize that as human beings, we're more rationalizing than we are rational. And we have to make sure to marshal that energy. I'm not saying to people, calm down. I'm saying use that energy, but also discipline it so that you move it in the right direction to really make difference.
So now, with everything that we've had going on, when it comes to oh my goodness, just the fight for so many different things, we see it being kind of dwarfed into, okay, now we're doing a fight to not wear masks, and now we're doing a fight to do this. As an advocate for so long, do you look at that and go, okay, do you just want to shake people sometimes? Like a reality check, like, just, that's not what this is for.
Well, I mean, I think, you've always had that kind of energy, but I think it also points to some of the inequities in our society really clearly. I mean, you look at Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old child being killed for having a toy gun in his hand, and you this 17-year-old guy who killed these protesters in Portland, who walked right past police. This white guy walks right past police with an automatic weapon, and they don't stop him, but police kill a 12-year-old child with a toy gun. I mean, what's wrong with this picture? We all know what's wrong with this picture. And this is where our inherent tendency to demonize African Americans in this systemic racist society that we live in, it has tended to create this, what Brian Stevenson, the great civil rights lawyer, calls a narrative of racial difference. And in that narrative of racial difference, people who look like me are considered more valuable, smarter, more competent, and safer than people who look like you ought to be. And so, that gets put into our mindset. But what we don't understand is how much of that is unconscious, and how much of it becomes just sort of a reaction that a police officer who does that, and I say this having worked with now, hundreds or thousands of police officers and other law enforcement people over the last X number of years, that my experience is that very few of them wake up in the morning and say, how can we suppress people of color today? That's not how it happens. It's just, you find yourself in a circumstance. This young man looks dangerous. That toy gun he has in his hand looks dangerous because everything that I've learned to associate with people like him is danger, thugs, and all this other kind of stuff. And this other young man reminds me of my nephew, or reminds me of, a kid. And so, well, he's got a gun, but what's he going to do with it? And they're not even rational thoughts. It's a visceral feeling that we have. And I think that this is why this notion of understanding implicit or unconscious bias is such an important part of this dynamic. Because, I mean, we also saw it in the protests, the protesters, the people who I call COVIDiots, these people who are these massive protests against trying to control this virus, who in the Michigan State House ran into the Michigan State House with automatic weapons, and the police just stood there like statues. And then, people are peacefully protesting in the streets of Washington, D.C., near where you and I live, and they get tear gassed and beaten with sticks and shot with rubber bullets. for peacefully protesting, where these other guys are running into the Michigan State House with guns and nobody tear gasses them. So, I mean, again, what's wrong with this picture? And I think we all know what's wrong with this picture. And unfortunately, I think a lot of folks in America, not just white folks, but mostly white folks who don't see it, who don't recognize it, or who don't want to recognize it. And I think all of it gets thrown into a big pot. So.
I think, we talked about it in the beginning where, this is not going to change immediately. Like, we're not going to see change happens at the speed of understanding. And when we have a better understanding, then we can go ahead and make an informed decision to change. And so a lot of that, the core of it is, are you even trying to understand? Like, we know social media is a good and a bad. It puts out a ton of information. It gives us access to people, but it also, you got to be careful about what it is you're listening to and what it is that you're seeing. And so with that being said, how would you explain to someone who's listening to this particular episode what they need to do in order for them to gain the best understanding in order to make an informed decision about what's going to be best for a family, what's going to be best when it comes to what we're protesting against, what we're standing on, inequality? What would be that first thing that they need to really be able to say, okay, I need to do this in order for me to understand a little bit more?
Well, I think one of the things is, we want to educate ourselves. I think that people need to take on educating themselves. I mean, we know that we live in a country where for 246 years, African Americans were legally enslaved in this country, or some semblance of legal slavery. We know that for another 99 years after that, people were legally designated as less than through things like Jim Crow laws and the like. That's 345 years. That's 17 generations in our country. And that's not even to suggest that after the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, that everything became fine, because we know better than that, right? But the point is that 17 generations in the mindset of our country, in the financial structure of our country, in lots of other things. And one of the challenges is, of course, the history books are always written by the dominant group. And so, I think one great example of this is when the Tulsa controversy happened just a few weeks ago, with President Trump speaking in Tulsa, and a conversation about the Tulsa massacre came up. And I read one study that showed that less than 30% of people in the United States had even heard of the Tulsa massacre. And of course, a lot of them just because of the Watchmen TV series that focused around it. Before that, even fewer. And the Tulsa massacre wasn't even a unique circumstance. We know that there were similar things in Greensboro, North Carolina, and Atlanta, and all over the country. Anytime an African American community rose up to have some kind of financial stability or stability in general, it wasn't unusual at all for white folks to come in and destroy and kill and do all the things they're going. And yet, that's not in most people's history book. I mean, I know a lot of people who are really good people, really committed to this issue, had never heard about the Tulsa massacre. And one person who grew up in Tulsa, who's a white gay man who I know, who's a real advocate for social justice, who said when he grew up in Tulsa, he learned about it as the Tulsa race riot. So, I mean, so there's this huge amount of miseducation in our background around this. And so I think starting by reading things like Howard Zinn's, People's History of the United States and other similar things to learn about the history. And then I think a second part is to do the work you need to do on yourself to understand how this history has impacted each of us and how it leaves us. For myself as a white-skinned Jewish man, to understand how privilege has affected my life and how it's shown up in my own experience, despite, in a lot of cases, my clear, conscious intent to want to be somebody who was supporting change. I still was raised in a culture of privilege. On top of that, I'm 6'5", and being tall adds to it. So to see how privilege shows up and to own that and be responsible for it. But I think that when we focus, in multiple thrusts, I mean, a lot of times we get into the either orness, like, should we do awareness work or should we do systems work? And should we do structural change and policy and practice? And my answer is always yes. We need to do all of that. We need to educate people. We need to We need to do work on developing awareness and learning to communicate more effectively. We need to look at the structures and systems of our society and policies and look how they affect. I mean, all of it. And it's all important, because if you do try to change policy, but you don't change mindset, the policy won't. It's a little bit like people who we know who've been on a diet, or overweight. I mean, anybody I know who's overweight knows how to lose weight, eat less and exercise more, but they don't do it. It has nothing to do with not knowing what needs to be done. It's the mindset behind it, right? And on the same level, if we change the mindset, but we don't change policy and procedure, that's not going to work either. So it's an all of the above that we need to be working on.
I absolutely love that. Speakeasy podcast listeners, you know that we are really big when it comes to World Voice League and Speakeasy and our Voice Matters blog about advocating for us. It's advocating for women, advocating for those who have been in homelessness, but that being that voice for the ones who feel as though they have no voice is very important. That's been ingrained in me. That's something that's been developed in me over time. And you may be asking yourself, how do I get started? So Howard, let them know how they can connect with you if they would love to get more information about, where do I start, in order for me to be able to say, I want to be the voice for this particular group.
Sure. Well, you can get me through two websites. One is howardjross.com, and the other is, my company is called Udarta, Udarta. That's the Hindu word for generosity. So udarta.com, and people can reach out to me there, and there are ways to communicate through there. And then the other thing is, my book Everyday Bias just came out in a second edition, and that's really a focus on unconscious bias and how it affects us. It includes some stuff about some of the things that have been happening over the last couple of years. The book originally came out a month after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, but we recently did an updated second edition. So those are a couple of ways that people can learn about my work.
I love it. Thank you so much for everything that you've done and that you continue to do. I know that a lot of times being an advocate is a thankless job. You get more things thrown at you than more things gifted to you. So I wanted to make sure that we put that information out there because, again, people need it now more than ever. And it's valuable every time you show up, every time you open your mouth, every time you are that person, every book that gets sold, it's valuable because it can help shift our nation. So with that being said, Speakeasy podcast listeners, we are all about taking things to a whole nother level. I applaud each and every one of you that are advocates that listen to our episodes. You guys reach out, you guys share different opportunities with us, and we appreciate it. We also know that, listen, every time you are advocating for someone, it is not always the easiest. It is not always the safest. So we want to make sure that you guys are being safe in what it is that you are doing. Make sure that you are doing it with community, that you are not going out alone. But also we want to say thank you. Thank you to each and every one of you. Without advocates, we would not be where we are today. And without advocates, we wouldn't be able to push on until tomorrow. With that being said, guys, remember, join the conversation, bit.ly/World Voice Community. And don't forget to press it out. See ya.